A humble maid, who had worked for years serving a powerful billionaire family, was suddenly accused of stealing a priceless jewel. She was dragged into court without a lawyer, humiliated in front of the world, and left completely alone against the influence of the rich. Everyone believed she was guilty because the word of the wealthy carried more weight than her tears and her truth. But in the middle of the trial, when it seemed that nothing could save her, the unexpected happened. The billionaire's own young son, who loved her like a second mother, broke free from his nanny, ran into the courtroom, and revealed a shocking secret, changing the entire case forever. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Clara had worked for the Hamilton family for many years. Every day, she cleaned the large rooms of their mansion, took care of the furniture, cooked meals, and always made sure everything was perfect. She was quiet, respectful, and deeply trusted by everyone in the house. Over the years, she grew close to little Ethan, the young son of Adam Hamilton. Ethan loved Clara very much and saw her as a second mother. Adam Hamilton, Ethan's father, was a serious man who had lost his wife some years ago. He had been raised by his mother, Margaret, a cold and strict woman who liked to control everything. Margaret had never liked Clara, even though she never said it openly. One day, a valuable family jewel suddenly went missing. It had been in the family for generations, and Margaret immediately blamed Clara. She said Clara was the only outsider in the house, and it had to be her. Clara was shocked and confused by the accusation. Margaret didn't wait for an investigation. She went straight to Adam and told him Clara must have stolen the jewel. She pointed out that Clara was poor and probably needed money. Adam, although unsure, trusted his mother's judgment. She had always been firm and persuasive. Clara tried to explain that she would never do such a thing. She begged them to look for the jewel again. Maybe someone misplaced it, but Margaret didn't want to hear it. Adam looked at Clara and, even without real proof, gave in to his mother's pressure. He told Clara that she had to leave the mansion. Clara felt heartbroken. After everything she had done for that family, they believed she was a thief. The police were called. Clara was taken to the local police station. The neighbors watched as she was escorted out in tears. She felt humiliated and betrayed. Her only crime had been working honestly for a family that no longer trusted her. At the police station, Clara sat in silence while officers asked her questions. They didn't arrest her, but they treated her like a suspect. Clara had no lawyer, no money, and no one to speak on her behalf. Her world was falling apart. She was allowed to go home, but she was told she would have to appear in court soon. The news spread quickly, and people in the area began to whisper behind her back. Her name was now linked to theft, even though she had never stolen anything in her life. Clara returned to her small house and cried for hours. She thought about how her whole life had changed in a single day. The worst part was not the court summons or even the public shame. It was losing Ethan. She missed his smile, his questions, his hugs. She had taken care of him like her own child. Now, she didn't know if she would ever see him again. In the days that followed, Clara received a letter from the court. She was being formally accused of stealing the jewel and had to prepare for trial. Clara had never been in a courtroom before. She didn't know how the legal system worked. She didn't have money for a lawyer, and she felt completely lost. She tried to contact some people she knew, but no one wanted to get involved. They were afraid of the Hamilton family. They were rich, powerful, and influential. Clara felt small and powerless. She walked through the streets with her head down, afraid to face anyone. At night, she couldn't sleep. She kept going over everything in her head: the jewel, the accusation, the coldness in Adam's eyes, the silence of the people around her. Each moment felt like a weight on her chest. She couldn't believe that after so many years of loyalty, she was being left to fight alone, without any help or support. Despite all the pain and confusion, Clara received one small ray of hope. A few days after the accusation, she heard a knock at her door. It was Ethan. He had run away from the mansion and come to see her. He hugged her tightly and started to cry. He said he didn't believe what his grandmother said. He told Clara he missed her and that the house wasn't the same without her. Clara cried too. She hadn't expected to see him again. Ethan brought her a small drawing he had made. It showed him holding Clara's hand. That moment gave Clara strength. Even though she had lost her job, her home in the mansion, and her dignity, she had not lost Ethan's love. He was too young to help her with lawyers or money, but his visit reminded her that not everyone had turned their back on her. It gave her the courage to keep going. The day of the trial was approaching, and Clara knew she had to find a way to defend herself. She began to collect anything she could that might help. Old photographs, letters of recommendation, testimonies from people she had worked for before the Hamiltons. She visited a legal aid center in the city, hoping someone might help her for free. There, she met a young intern who promised to do what he could, even if he wasn't very experienced. Clara gave him all the information she had. They went over the events of the day the jewel disappeared. She remembered everything, where she had been, what time she cleaned which room, and who else had been in the house. It wasn't much, but it was something. Clara didn't know if it would be enough, but she was determined to tell the truth. She was going to face the Hamiltons in court, not as a servant, but as a woman who refused to be crushed by injustice. While Clara was still trying to understand how she had ended up in such a terrible situation, the Hamilton family was already getting ready to win the case. Clara had no lawyer, no money, and no idea how to deal with a courtroom. She was scared but tried to stay strong. On the other side, Margaret Hamilton wasted no time. She went straight to her private lawyer and hired the best one in the city. His name was Dr. Marcelo Ribeiro, and he was known for never losing a case involving rich families. Margaret told him to make sure Clara would be seen as guilty in front of everyone. She wanted the trial to be more than a legal matter. She wanted it to be public and dramatic. Soon, newspapers started publishing headlines calling Clara a thief. News websites and radio shows repeated the same story: housemaid steals from Hamiltons. Clara watched her name being destroyed in public before the trial even began. It felt unfair. Adam Hamilton noticed how fast everything was moving. He saw how his mother was handling the case, and although he didn't agree with all her decisions, he stayed quiet. Deep inside, he felt uncomfortable. He remembered how Clara used to care for Ethan, how she always arrived early, worked hard, and never once gave them any reason to doubt her. But at the same time, he trusted his mother. She had raised him alone and always told him what was best for the family. He didn't know what to believe. Adam tried to avoid the media attention and focused on his work, but the guilt stayed in his mind. Every time he passed Clara's old room, he remembered her. He didn't say anything to the lawyer, and he didn't try to stop the media attacks. He was stuck between two sides, one full of respect for his mother and another filled with guilt about Clara. Still, he chose silence. Ethan felt that something was wrong in the house. Clara wasn't there anymore, and no one explained things to him properly. He was only a child, but he understood that people were sad and angry. He asked his father many times where Clara was, but Adam never gave a clear answer. Margaret told Ethan not to worry, saying Clara had done something bad and wouldn't come back. Ethan didn't believe it. He remembered how Clara used to sing to him, help with his homework, and make his favorite snacks. He missed her stories at bedtime and her warm smile. Nothing felt the same without her. The new staff didn't know how to take care of him like she did. One night, Ethan drew a picture of him and Clara, just like the one he gave her before. He kept it hidden in his drawer. Deep down, he hoped that one day she would come back and things would go back to the way they were before. While the Hamilton family prepared for a clean victory, the real investigation seemed to be ignored. Clara tried to gather anything that might help prove her innocence. She asked a neighbor to go back with her to the house to check something. She remembered that there were security cameras near the room where the jewel was kept, but when she asked about the footage, no one gave her a straight answer. Eventually, she learned something strange. The camera that recorded the room had been turned off at the exact time the jewel went missing. That detail seemed important, but nobody was interested in it. Clara told a court official about it, but he said it wasn't relevant without evidence of who turned it off. Clara didn't know how to argue. She wasn't a lawyer. She had no idea who could help her dig deeper into this. That discovery made her more confused. Why would a security camera be off during a robbery? Margaret didn't let anything slow her down. She pushed for the trial date to be moved up, wanting everything to happen quickly. Her lawyer followed her instructions perfectly. He prepared statements to show how trustworthy the Hamilton family was and how suspicious Clara had always been, even without evidence. Margaret spoke to journalists and made small, off-record comments that suggested Clara had done this before. Some magazines published rumors that Clara had money problems or a secret debt, which wasn't true. Clara saw her image being destroyed more and more every day. The people who once greeted her on the street now looked away. Even some former friends stopped returning her calls. Clara felt like the world had turned against her, and she hadn't even had the chance to speak. She kept telling herself she was innocent, but with everything going on, it seemed like no one wanted to listen. The system had already made its choice before she could defend herself. As the trial day approached, Clara felt a heavy pressure on her shoulders. She barely slept at night. The newspapers still called her a criminal. Her court-appointed defender barely talked to her, and when he did, he acted like her case was just another file on his desk. Meanwhile, Margaret made sure the courtroom would be full of reporters and important people. She wanted the public to see that no one steals from the Hamilton family and gets away with it. Adam still didn't speak. He watched everything happen and told himself it was too late to stop it now. Ethan stayed quiet too, but he still thought about Clara every night. On the outside, it looked like the Hamiltons had already won, but inside Clara, something was still alive, the need to prove the truth. Even with the odds against her, she decided she would fight. She stood up on the morning of the trial with fear in her heart, but ready to face everything. Clara arrived at the courthouse early in the morning. She wore her old work uniform, the same one she used every day when she worked at the Hamilton mansion. It was all she had. She didn't have money to buy fancy clothes or pay for a proper lawyer. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her back straight. Inside the courtroom, people whispered as she walked past. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment. She sat alone, holding a small bag with a few documents. Her eyes were red, but she fought back the tears. She didn't want to cry in front of everyone. The judge walked in, and the trial began. On the other side of the room, the prosecutor stood up. He had been hired by Margaret Hamilton and was ready to follow her plan. He called Clara an opportunist, someone who got too comfortable inside a rich house and thought she could take what didn't belong to her. Clara just listened, silently. As the prosecutor continued, he painted Clara as someone who had taken advantage of the Hamiltons' trust. He said she had used her position in the house to steal something valuable. He used words like ungrateful, calculated, and fake loyalty. The courtroom was quiet as he spoke. People were listening carefully, and many nodded along as if everything made sense. But Clara knew those things weren't true. She had never stolen anything. Still, without a proper lawyer to defend her, she had no way to stop the accusations. The prosecutor showed photos of the missing jewel and described its value. He explained how Clara had access to the room and made it sound like only she could have taken it. Then he brought in witnesses, people who once worked in the mansion or knew the family. Most of them said things that supported the Hamilton side. Some even changed their words a little to match what the prosecutor needed. The truth didn't seem important. Adam sat near his mother, his arms crossed and his eyes staring at the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at Clara. He had memories of her being kind, caring, and loyal. But he was confused. His mother had told him that justice needed to be done, that Clara had betrayed them. And now everything was happening so fast. He felt stuck. If he spoke up, it would go against Margaret, and he didn't have the strength to do that. So he stayed quiet. Every time Clara glanced in his direction, hoping to see something in his eyes, maybe regret or support, Adam looked away. He was clearly uncomfortable, but he kept his distance. Meanwhile, Margaret sat beside him with confidence. She whispered comments to her lawyer, smiled when things went her way, and acted like the outcome was already decided. To her, this trial was more about power and control than finding the real truth. Clara's voice didn't seem to matter. In the back of the courtroom, Ethan sat with his nanny. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he insisted on coming. No one really noticed him at first. He watched the adults talk, argue, and accuse. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. Clara, the person who once held his hand when he was scared, was now standing in the middle of all this. Ethan didn't believe she had done anything wrong. He remembered how she always helped others and never asked for anything. But no one asked him what he thought. He had to sit quietly, watching the people he loved fight in a way he didn't understand. The courtroom felt cold to him. Everyone looked serious. Even his father didn't smile. Ethan kept his eyes on Clara the whole time. He didn't say a word, but inside he wished he could run up and hug her. He didn't want her to feel alone. But children don't get to speak in court. Outside the courtroom, the media was waiting. News cameras were everywhere, and reporters shouted questions to anyone involved. Headlines had already labeled Clara as guilty. Housemaid steals from billionaire family, and Hamilton's betrayed by servant were written in bold letters across websites and newspapers. No one waited for the verdict. The story had already been told, and Clara was the villain. People online posted angry comments about her. Some called her greedy, others said she planned the whole thing from the start. Clara didn't even have a way to defend herself. Her face was on the news, her name was trending, and her life was being destroyed in front of the entire country. She felt like she had no voice. She wasn't famous, rich, or powerful. All she had was her truth, and nobody wanted to hear it. Still, she kept her head up. She reminded herself of her values, of her late mother's advice, and held on to whatever strength she had left. When it was Clara's turn to speak, the courtroom went quiet again. She stood up slowly and walked to the witness stand. Her hands were cold, but she didn't shake. She took a deep breath and looked at the judge. Then she looked straight ahead and spoke clearly. She said she never touched anything that didn't belong to her. She explained how she had worked in that house for years, giving her best every day. She said she had loved Ethan like her own child and never imagined hurting the family. Her voice cracked once, but she didn't cry. She spoke from the heart. She said she knew people had already made up their minds, but she had to say the truth anyway. As she talked, most people didn't react. Some looked bored, others skeptical. It was as if her words had no weight. No one clapped, no one showed support. When she finished, she sat down again, alone, as if nothing she said mattered at all. As the trial continued, small inconsistencies started to appear in the case. During the first days, everything seemed to go exactly as Margaret Hamilton had planned. But slowly, some details began to stand out. A few people close to the Hamilton family were suddenly unavailable or unwilling to speak. The old housekeeper, who had worked at the mansion even longer than Clara, was mysteriously removed from her position. No one explained why. When Clara's court-appointed helper tried to reach her for a statement, the woman refused to comment. Then, one of the younger maids quietly told someone that she had seen Margaret entering the jewelry room late at night, just before the jewel disappeared. But the maid quickly backed off, saying she was afraid of losing her job. Fear was everywhere. The more Clara listened to these fragments of truth, the more confused she felt. She knew something didn't add up, but without support, she had no way to dig deeper or prove any of it. Inside the mansion, things weren't as calm as they looked. Ethan had been paying close attention to what was happening. Although he was still very young, he noticed the sudden change in how adults behaved around him. People whispered more, avoided certain topics, and changed the subject when he asked questions. Ethan started remembering something that had happened the night the jewel disappeared. He had seen someone moving around near the jewelry room when he got up to get water. But when he told his grandmother what he saw the next morning, she told him it was just a dream and not to mention it again. At the time, he believed her. But now, after seeing Clara in court and hearing how she was being treated, he wasn't so sure anymore. Ethan tried to talk to his father, Adam, about what he remembered. He waited for the right moment and finally approached him, but Adam seemed distracted and didn't listen. Ethan felt invisible. Margaret began noticing that Ethan was acting differently. He asked more questions and didn't seem interested in the toys she bought him. At first, she ignored it, but soon she realized he was thinking too much about Clara and the trial. She decided to act quickly. She told Ethan not to worry about grown-up problems and started spoiling him with new video games, treats, and a promised trip to the amusement park. She hugged him more often and told him how special he was. But behind all the affection, Margaret was trying to keep control. She feared that if Ethan spoke up, someone might start asking questions, so she kept him close and distracted. When Ethan mentioned again that he remembered something from the night of the theft, Margaret smiled and told him she believed him, but that it was better not to say anything. She said people might get confused and blame him. Scared, Ethan stopped asking and kept his thoughts to himself. Clara, on the other hand, was running out of hope. The trial wasn't going well, and her court-appointed defender barely talked to her. Every day, she went to court feeling smaller, as if nothing she said mattered. She still wore her old uniform because it was the only formal clothing she had. People stared at her like she was already guilty. One afternoon, as she returned home, tired and emotionally drained, she heard a knock at her door. A young woman stood there, holding a folder. She introduced herself as Emily, a new lawyer just starting her career. Emily had been following Clara's case in the news and felt something wasn't right. She said she didn't have much experience, but she believed Clara was telling the truth. Clara was surprised. No one had believed her in weeks. Emily asked if she could represent her officially. Clara hesitated at first, but quickly agreed. She had nothing left to lose and needed someone, anyone, who was willing to help. Emily began reviewing everything she could about the case. She stayed up late reading the court transcripts, watching the news reports, and writing down every detail Clara shared. She noticed how many statements seemed inconsistent. She also found it strange that no one had questioned why the main security camera in the jewelry room was turned off that night. Clara told her about the maid who mentioned seeing Margaret, but they didn't know how to find her. Emily took notes, made a list of people to talk to, and promised Clara she would do her best. She went to the courthouse to file the paperwork to officially replace Clara's old defender. The judge agreed, even warning Emily that this case was complicated and risky. Emily didn't back down. She knew she was inexperienced, but she believed in justice and in giving people a voice. Clara felt, for the first time in weeks, that she was not alone. Emily's presence gave her a small but powerful hope. While Clara and Emily worked quietly to prepare for the next steps, the Hamilton mansion remained full of secrets. Some of the staff were clearly nervous. A few maids avoided eye contact. Some stopped speaking to each other entirely. Margaret acted as if nothing was wrong, controlling everything with a smile. Adam, meanwhile, stayed quiet and distant, still unsure of what to believe. Ethan kept thinking about the night he saw someone, walking down the hallway. He knew what he saw. He didn't know how to explain it, but he wanted to help Clara. Every time he saw her in court, his heart felt heavy. But his grandmother's warnings kept playing in his head. He didn't want to cause trouble or make people angry, so he stayed silent. Margaret continued to watch everyone carefully, especially Ethan. She gave him more gifts and said nice things, but it was clear she was hiding something. The truth was close, but still locked inside the mansion. Emily started her investigation with care and patience. She visited the courthouse archives and asked for every document related to the Hamilton mansion and the supposed theft. As she read through the reports, she noticed small mistakes that didn't make sense. Times didn't match, notes from officers were incomplete, and the record about the broken camera seemed too vague. It looked as if someone wanted to hide more than they revealed. Emily compared the information with Clara's statements, and things didn't align. Clara had always been clear about where she was that night, but the reports ignored some of her words. Emily returned to Clara and asked more questions, writing everything in her notebook. The more she learned, the more she realized this case was not about a simple theft. Something deeper was being covered up. She decided she needed to go to the mansion itself to look around and maybe find answers that were missing from the official papers. While Emily was busy with her investigation, Ethan continued to feel restless. He had questions that no one seemed willing to answer. One afternoon, while Margaret sat in the living room reading, Ethan gathered courage and asked again about the night the jewel disappeared. He said he remembered something and wanted to know if Clara was really guilty. Margaret lowered her book, stared at him coldly, and told him to stop asking. She said adults had solved the matter and children should not get involved. Ethan didn't back down. He asked again why she was near the jewelry room that night. Margaret's face hardened. She warned him that if he kept insisting, she would send him away to a boarding school far from home. Ethan froze. The thought of leaving his father terrified him. Margaret leaned closer and repeated her warning. Ethan stayed quiet after that, but the fear inside him grew stronger. He knew his grandmother was hiding something, but he also knew she was dangerous. Adam, meanwhile, was under growing pressure. The media kept asking questions about the case, and people outside the family began to whisper that the Hamiltons were hiding details. The trial was becoming a spectacle, and Adam couldn't escape the attention. One night, he sat alone in his office and opened old recordings stored on his computer. He wasn't looking for proof about the jewel. He wanted to remember better times. As he scrolled through the files, he found a video of Clara with Ethan, taken shortly after his wife's death. In the video, Clara was sitting with the boy in his room, comforting him while he cried. She told him he was loved and safe, holding him until he calmed down. Watching the scene, Adam felt something shift inside him. He realized Clara had been more than an employee. She had been family. For the first time, he doubted his mother's certainty. Maybe Clara wasn't guilty. Maybe he had been wrong. Emily's search led her to an important discovery. She managed to speak with someone who had attended a charity event a few days after the night the jewel supposedly disappeared. That person told her they saw Margaret Hamilton wearing the exact same jewel at the event. Emily was shocked. If the jewel had been on Margaret's neck at the gala, then it was never stolen in the first place. She quickly looked for photos or news articles from the event, and for a short time she found one picture online showing Margaret in a dark dress with the jewel shining around her neck. Excited, she saved it and prepared to add it to Clara's defense. But the next day, when she checked again, the photo was gone. The website had removed it, and the source refused to talk. It was as if the evidence had been erased overnight. Emily realized that Margaret's influence reached far beyond the courtroom. She had power to make things disappear. The loss of the evidence frustrated Emily, but it didn't stop her. She returned to Clara with the story and explained what she had found. Clara wasn't surprised. She always suspected Margaret had more to do with the case than anyone admitted. Hearing that the jewel had been seen in public only made her more certain. Emily promised to keep searching, even if the picture was gone. She suggested they try to contact other guests who were present at the event. Maybe someone else had noticed the jewel. Clara agreed, even though she felt the walls closing in around her. Each day in court was harder, and the accusations grew louder. She had almost no allies, except for Emily and her memories of Ethan. Clara thought about him often, hoping he still believed in her. For Emily, the missing evidence was not an end, but a clue. Proof that Margaret was desperate to keep the truth hidden, which meant they were getting closer. Inside the Hamilton household, Margaret began to feel the pressure too. She could sense Adam's silence was not the same as before, and Ethan's behavior made her uneasy. She knew Emily was digging into the case, and even if the young lawyer was inexperienced, she feared persistence could lead to results. Margaret told herself she had to act before things got out of control. She tightened her control over the staff, warning them not to speak to anyone outside. She kept Ethan busy with gifts and distractions, though his eyes betrayed his doubts. With Adam, she used guilt, reminding him of family honor and responsibility. Margaret's determination grew stronger. She had built her life on power and reputation, and she would not allow a servant to destroy it. But for the first time, cracks were showing. People were asking questions, and secrets were harder to control. Margaret realized the circle was closing in. If she wanted to protect herself, she would need to take drastic action. On the third day of the trial, the atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. The judge sat in his chair, the lawyers prepared their notes, and Clara tried to remain calm, even though she felt broken inside. Emily whispered encouragement, telling her to stay strong. The Hamilton family occupied their usual seats, with Margaret looking confident as always. Adam sat quietly, his expression unreadable. The trial was moving forward like the other days, with the prosecution continuing to attack Clara's character. Suddenly, the heavy doors of the courtroom opened, and Ethan slipped inside, having escaped from the nanny who was supposed to watch him. People turned in surprise as the boy ran straight to Clara. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her tightly as if to protect her. Then in a loud voice, he pressed his small hand over her mouth and said, "Shh! I know who did this, Mommy." The entire courtroom froze in shock. The sudden outburst created chaos in the room. Journalists raised their cameras, people murmured, and the judge called for order. Clara froze, holding Ethan close, unsure of what was happening. Margaret's face turned pale, and Adam immediately stood up. The judge asked for the boy to be removed, but Adam interrupted. He stepped forward, his voice shaking as he said that Ethan should be allowed to speak. He explained that his son had been quiet for weeks, holding something inside, and now he needed to be heard. After a short hesitation, the judge agreed. Ethan looked around nervously, then at Clara, before speaking again. His small voice filled the silence of the courtroom. He said that one night, after waking up for water, he saw his grandmother, Margaret, in the office. He saw her holding something shiny and hiding it inside a box. He also heard her whisper to herself that Clara would be an easy target. His words made everyone in the room go silent again. The prosecutor quickly tried to take control of the situation. He stood up and argued that Ethan was just a child, too young to understand what he saw or heard. He said children often confuse dreams with reality and reminded the court that memories could be unreliable. Margaret leaned back in her chair, trying to regain her composure, but her fingers tapped nervously against her armrest. Ethan, however, did not back down. He insisted he was telling the truth. He described the box where Margaret had hidden the jewel, a dark wooden box with a golden lock kept inside her office desk. He also repeated the exact words she had said: "Clara will be an easy target." The details were too specific to ignore. People in the courtroom exchanged looks, whispering to one another. Even the judge frowned, realizing that Ethan's testimony could not be dismissed so easily, especially because of the precision of his account. Clara stood frozen, her heart racing. She couldn't believe Ethan had spoken up in front of everyone. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from relief. For the first time since the nightmare began, someone had told the truth out loud, and it came from the person she loved most in the world. Emily immediately reacted, rising to her feet and telling the judge that Ethan's statement was crucial and must be investigated. She pointed out that the boy had no reason to lie and that his details matched with the inconsistencies already found in the case. The judge agreed to pause the session and ordered an inquiry into Ethan's testimony. Adam, standing nearby, looked torn between shock and guilt. He finally dared to meet Clara's eyes, and what he saw there made him lower his head in shame. He realized how blind he had been to the truth and how much Clara had suffered unfairly. Margaret, who until then had controlled every part of the process, showed her first signs of weakness. She tried to stay calm, but her lips trembled slightly as she whispered something to her lawyer. Her confident expression was gone, replaced by unease. For years, she had manipulated situations, silenced voices, and shaped reality to fit her desires. But now, her own grandson had spoken against her, and she couldn't stop him. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, some already preparing headlines about the shocking twist. Reporters whispered that the perfect Hamilton image was falling apart. Adam sat still, visibly shaken, while Ethan leaned against Clara, holding her hand tightly. Margaret finally raised her voice, saying Ethan was confused and manipulated by Clara, but her words lacked their usual force. Everyone could see her composure cracking. The mask she had worn so carefully was starting to slip, and for the first time, people questioned her role in the case. The judge announced that the trial would be temporarily suspended. He said Ethan's testimony raised serious questions that needed to be investigated before moving forward. Officers were instructed to review the office in the mansion and check for the wooden box Ethan described. Emily smiled faintly at Clara, whispering that this was their chance. Clara, though overwhelmed, felt a wave of hope. For weeks, no one had believed her, and now the truth had finally begun to surface through Ethan's courage. Margaret sat in silence, her body tense, her hands clenched together. She knew the circle was closing in. Adam placed a protective arm around his son, still unable to process everything he had heard. The courtroom emptied slowly, filled with tension and whispers of change. For the first time, Clara walked out not as a defeated woman, but as someone who might still have a future. And beside her, Emily knew the fight had only just begun. With the investigation now open, the Hamilton mansion felt different. Tension grew in every corner of the house, and for the first time, Adam decided he could no longer stay silent. He waited until Ethan was asleep, and then went to his mother's office. Margaret was sitting behind her large desk, pretending to read, but she knew why he was there. Adam closed the door and demanded the truth. His voice was firm, louder than he had ever spoken to her before. He asked why Ethan had described her actions so clearly, why the box the boy mentioned matched details no child could invent. Margaret looked at him with sharp eyes, but she realized her control over him was slipping. Adam pressed again, telling her he could not continue defending her if she didn't explain. The air between them was heavy, and finally, Margaret stood up. She began to speak, her voice calm but filled with bitterness, ready to confess her reasons. The conversation quickly turned into a heated argument. Adam accused his mother of destroying Clara's life without real evidence. Margaret answered by saying Clara had been growing too close to Ethan, filling a role that didn't belong to her. She said Ethan saw Clara as a mother, and even Adam looked at her differently, almost as if she was replacing his late wife. Margaret's tone was cold, but emotional. She admitted she felt threatened. She feared Clara would take control of the family, and she couldn't allow that. Margaret explained that she never intended to cause so much damage. Her original plan was only to scare Clara, to remind her of her place, but things escalated when the jewel went missing. Once the suspicion fell on Clara, she let the lie continue, thinking it would protect her family's legacy. Adam listened in silence, devastated. He realized how much his mother's fear had blinded them all, and how his silence had made him part of the injustice. Adam walked out of the office in shock. For years he had trusted his mother completely, but now he felt betrayed. He remembered every moment Clara had shown kindness and how he ignored it under Margaret's influence. He went to Ethan's room and sat beside his sleeping son. He thought about how Ethan had been braver than him, speaking the truth when adults stayed quiet. That night, Adam made a decision. He went back to Margaret's office, not to argue, but to search. He opened drawers, moved books, and finally discovered a small safe hidden behind a cabinet. After several attempts, he managed to open it with a key he found in Margaret's desk. Inside, he saw the missing jewel, carefully wrapped in cloth. But that wasn't all. The safe also contained envelopes with money, documents, and other items that didn't seem to belong there. Adam stared at the contents, realizing this was the proof that could finally change everything. The next morning, Adam didn't hesitate. He carried the safe to the police station and handed it over. The officers were surprised, but they immediately began taking notes and recording the evidence. Adam explained where he had found it and how it confirmed Ethan's testimony. He admitted that his mother had been hiding the jewel and possibly other valuables. The police thanked him and promised to include the discovery in the investigation. Adam felt a mix of relief and guilt. He had done the right thing now, but it came too late to undo the damage Clara had already suffered. Outside the station, reporters were waiting, and news spread quickly. Headlines changed overnight. Instead of calling Clara a thief, the media began to focus on Margaret Hamilton's involvement. The public, who had been so quick to judge Clara, started questioning the family's power and secrets. For the first time, Clara's name appeared alongside words like innocence and injustice. This time, things were different. Emily presented the discovery of the jewel and explained that it had been found hidden inside Margaret's office safe. She also pointed out the other suspicious items, suggesting there could be more behind the story. The judge allowed Clara to speak again, and she told her story with more confidence than before. Her voice was steady as she repeated that she had never stolen anything. She talked about her years of loyalty, her love for Ethan, and her respect for the Hamilton household. The courtroom listened closely, and this time people didn't dismiss her words. Reporters wrote down every detail, cameras focused on her face, and even members of the public who had once believed she was guilty now began to feel sympathy. Emily's arguments grew stronger, supported by the physical evidence. The entire case shifted, and Clara was no longer seen as the accused, but as a victim of a powerful family's lies. Margaret was forced to sit in the courtroom and watch the truth unfold. For the first time, her control was gone. She didn't speak, her eyes fixed on the floor as the prosecution tried to recover, but failed. Adam sat on the other side, holding Ethan close, finally breaking free from his mother's influence. He felt ashamed for not protecting Clara sooner, but he was determined to support her now. Ethan, though still a child, felt proud that his voice had made a difference. Clara, standing tall, looked at them both with mixed emotions. She had suffered humiliation, pain, and fear, but at that moment she saw a path toward justice. The people who once turned their backs on her were beginning to see the truth. The weight of lies was finally lifting, and for the first time, the future didn't seem hopeless. The case was far from over, but Clara finally had proof on her side, and the world was starting to listen. With the safe evidence and Adam's testimony now part of the case, the courtroom atmosphere changed completely. For weeks, Clara had sat in silence, treated like a criminal, but now the weight was shifting in her favor. Emily stood before the judge with a carefully prepared presentation. She showed a timeline of events, starting with the night the jewel disappeared and ending with the discovery of Margaret's secret safe. Every step of the story revealed how Margaret had manipulated the situation, creating a false narrative that made Clara look guilty. The prosecution tried to interrupt, but the judge allowed Emily to continue. The evidence was too strong to ignore. Clara, sitting beside her lawyer, felt her hands shaking, but this time from relief. For the first time in months, she wasn't invisible. Her truth was being spoken out loud in front of everyone. She lowered her head and whispered a quiet prayer, thanking for the chance to finally be heard. The judge listened carefully, taking notes as Emily explained each point. She showed how Clara's access to the jewelry room had been exaggerated, how the broken camera had been conveniently ignored, and how witnesses were influenced by Margaret's power. Emily then connected these details with the jewel being seen at the charity event, tying the pieces together. Adam stood and confirmed his part, admitting his silence had made him an accomplice. His words were heavy but honest, and the courtroom reacted with murmurs of surprise. Margaret, sitting in the front row, remained stiff, her lips pressed tightly together. She avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Adam and Ethan. The judge finally raised her hand and declared that the process had been flawed from the beginning. She said Clara should never have been held under suspicion for so long without proper evidence. With that, she announced Clara's immediate release. The courtroom filled with noise, some gasps, some applause, as people realized the tide had turned. As soon as the decision was spoken, Ethan broke free from his nanny's grasp and ran across the room. Without hesitation, he jumped into Clara's arms, holding her tightly. "You're my heart, Mommy," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. The words touched everyone present. Some people cried, others clapped softly, moved by the child's honesty and love. Clara hugged Ethan with all her strength, tears streaming down her face. She whispered to him that she would never leave him, no matter what people had said before. For Clara, that moment meant more than the judge's ruling. It was proof that she still had Ethan's love and trust. The journalists captured the scene, their cameras flashing, and within minutes the image was spread across the media. A woman once condemned was now embraced as a symbol of hope and resilience. Clara didn't think about reputation or headlines, but about the boy who gave her strength to keep fighting. Outside the courthouse, the media exploded with the news. For weeks, headlines had called Clara a thief, a liar, and a disgrace. Now, those same outlets wrote news stories, describing her as brave, strong, and innocent. Television anchors spoke about injustice, while online articles praised her dignity throughout the ordeal. Comment sections filled with people apologizing for judging too quickly, and some even called Clara a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. For Clara, however, the noise of the media wasn't important. She didn't want fame or revenge. All she wanted was her name cleared and her life back. She told Emily she didn't plan to sue the family or demand money. Her only goal was to walk freely without shame and to live without people whispering behind her back. Emily admired her humility, knowing many in her place would have demanded more. Clara's victory was not about punishing Margaret, but about regaining her dignity. Adam took the opportunity to address the press gathered outside. He admitted publicly that he had failed Clara by believing his mother without proof. He explained how he had allowed her influence to silence him and how his silence had caused harm. Reporters asked difficult questions, but Adam didn't hide. He apologized directly to Clara, not as part of a legal strategy, but as a father and a man who had been wrong. Clara listened quietly, not answering right away, but her eyes showed she appreciated his honesty. Ethan stood by Adam's side, smiling for the first time in weeks. The boy's relief was visible, as if the heavy burden he carried had finally been lifted. For the first time since the trial began, father and son stood together, united in truth rather than in fear. Clara felt grateful for Ethan's courage and for Adam's change of heart. For her, their sincerity was enough to begin healing. Margaret, however, could not escape the consequences. The judge announced that she would be called to a new hearing to answer for her actions. The discovery of the jewel, the manipulation of witnesses, and her attempt to frame Clara were now part of a new case. Margaret didn't react outwardly, but her pale face betrayed her shock. She was escorted out of the courtroom by her lawyer, who avoided the press at all costs. Reporters shouted her name, demanding answers, but she said nothing. Clara watched from a distance, not with anger, but with a sense of closure. She had no desire to hurt Margaret further. Her only wish was to be left in peace, to rebuild her life, and to give Ethan the love and security he needed. As the day ended, Clara walked out of the courthouse free, holding Ethan's hand. Justice had finally begun to restore what had been broken, and a new chapter in her life was ready to start. When the court reconvened, Margaret made one last attempt to regain control. She raised her head high, spoke with authority, and tried to convince the judge and the jury that everything being said against her was false. She insisted Ethan was confused, Adam was emotional, and Clara was manipulating the situation through sympathy. For a moment, the courtroom was quiet, but then Emily stood up with documents and testimonies she had gathered. She presented written statements from staff who had left the mansion, people who were now willing to talk. With Margaret's influence weakened, they admitted details they had been too afraid to share before. One maid confessed that Margaret had pressured her to lie during the first hearings. Another employee revealed Margaret often used intimidation to control the staff. Slowly, Margaret's arguments fell apart, piece by piece. The more she tried to defend herself, the more her words looked desperate and hollow compared to the solid evidence in front of everyone. As testimonies continued, shocking details from the past came to light. It was revealed that this was not the first time Margaret had accused an employee of theft without proof. Years earlier, a gardener had been dismissed under similar circumstances, accused of stealing valuable items that were never actually proven missing. Another worker admitted she had been threatened by Margaret after refusing to cover up an incident. The courtroom gasped as these stories surfaced. They painted a pattern of behavior that showed Margaret's obsession with control and her willingness to destroy others to protect her image. The prosecutor, who at the beginning of the case had been firmly on her side, changed his stance. He asked for a criminal investigation against Margaret, listing charges such as perjury, defamation, and obstruction of justice. The judge nodded and agreed that the matter could no longer be ignored. Margaret, who once appeared untouchable, now sat in silence, exposed in front of everyone. Clara listened to everything, tears in her eyes. Not tears of pain this time, but of relief. After so many humiliations, so many days of doubt, she was finally hearing the truth acknowledged in front of the world. The judge declared her officially innocent, clearing her of all charges. The courtroom erupted with noise as reporters quickly sent the news across the country. On live broadcasts, Clara's name appeared with words like "innocence confirmed" and "justice done." For months she had been called a thief, but now the nation saw her as a victim of lies and cruelty. Clara held Ethan's hand tightly as she left the courthouse, no longer ashamed. Outside, people clapped. Some even apologized to her directly for believing the false accusations. She felt a weight lift from her chest. Her life had been broken apart by lies, but her name was clean again. This was all she had wanted from the beginning, not revenge, but truth. The days after the verdict brought Clara unexpected attention. Job offers began arriving from wealthy families who admired her resilience. Some offered her generous salaries, others promised comfortable housing and stability. But Clara politely declined each one. She told Emily that she needed time to rest, to heal, and to decide her future without rushing. She had spent too long living under the shadow of others' power and accusations. Now, she wanted peace. She dreamed of spending quiet days with Ethan, walking freely through the streets without fear of whispers or judgment. Emily supported her decision, knowing that Clara deserved the freedom to choose her own path. Clara was not interested in becoming a symbol or living in the spotlight. She only wanted to reclaim her life and dignity. For the first time in months, she could wake up in the morning without fear of what people thought of her. That was her true victory. Emily's role in the trial did not go unnoticed. Lawyers, judges, and even journalists praised her determination and courage. She had entered the case as an inexperienced young lawyer, unsure if she could handle the responsibility, but she had proven herself capable. Newspapers began calling her the rising star of justice, and law firms reached out with offers. Emily, however, remained humble. She said the case was not about her, but about fighting for someone who had been treated unfairly. Still, when Clara hugged her and thanked her with tears in her eyes, Emily allowed herself to feel proud. She had made a difference, and that was why she had chosen to become a lawyer. In private, she admitted to herself that the trial had changed her too. She now knew she had the strength to face powerful people and win. Seeing Clara free was her greatest reward, and she carried that moment in her heart with gratitude. Meanwhile, the Hamilton family faced a new reality. Ethan asked Adam if he could spend more time with Clara, saying he felt safe with her. Adam, though hesitant at first, agreed, realizing it was what his son truly needed. He had seen Clara's love for Ethan, and he no longer doubted her intentions. For Adam, the trial forced him to look at himself differently. He regretted his silence and the blind trust he had given his mother. He decided to rebuild his values and his relationship with Ethan, putting honesty before pride. Margaret, on the other hand, was left isolated. Friends distanced themselves, her influence in society collapsed, and she now faced her own criminal charges. The woman who once controlled everything had lost her power. Clara, Emily, Adam, and Ethan walked out of the courthouse that final day with their lives changed forever. Lies had nearly destroyed them, but truth had given them a second chance. Margaret entered the courtroom, but this time she was no longer the accuser. She was the one standing at the defendant's table, facing the same justice system she once controlled with her money and influence. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The jewel had been found inside her own safe. Testimonies from former employees confirmed her history of intimidation and lies. Records also revealed money transfers and valuables hidden without proper documentation. The prosecutor listed the charges clearly: false accusation, harassment, and misappropriation of family assets. Margaret sat still, her once proud posture now heavy with shame. She tried to defend herself, saying everything she did was for the good of her family, but her words carried no weight anymore. The judge listened, considered the facts, and then gave the verdict. Margaret was guilty. Her sentence was strict but fair: house arrest, a heavy financial penalty, and permanent removal from any control over the Hamilton fortune. Adam watched the trial with mixed emotions. He had grown up obeying his mother's every word, but now he saw her stripped of the power she had used for so long. When the sentence was read, he didn't feel joy. Instead, he felt a deep sadness, knowing how far she had gone to hold on to control. But at the same time, he knew it was necessary. Justice had to be done. Once court was adjourned, Adam officially stepped into his new role as the leader of the Hamilton businesses. Reporters asked how he planned to move forward, and his answer surprised many. He said the family empire would no longer operate with arrogance or fear. He promised to lead with transparency, fairness, and respect for all workers. For Adam, this was not only about saving the family's reputation, but also about repairing the damage caused by years of silence. His first step was to rebuild trust, starting with Clara. Adam reached out to Clara personally. He met her not as an employer or accuser, but as someone who respected her strength. He told her he'd been inspired by her courage and by the injustice she endured. He shared an idea for a foundation dedicated to helping women who had been falsely accused or unfairly treated, just like her. Adam admitted the idea came from seeing Clara's suffering and her determination to keep her dignity. Clara listened carefully. She didn't want to return to the mansion or to her old life as a servant, but when Adam explained she would not work as staff, but as the director of the foundation, Clara smiled. This was different. It was a chance to use her painful story to help others. Clara accepted, not out of obligation, but because she believed something good could come from everything she had endured. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one she chose freely. Emily celebrated Clara's decision as much as Adam did. The young lawyer saw her former client now stepping into a leadership role that she fully deserved. At the foundation's announcement, journalists called Clara a symbol of resistance and dignity. But Clara herself avoided those titles. She insisted she was just a woman who wanted to live honestly. Still, she worked with Emily to shape the foundation's mission, providing legal aid, emotional support, and opportunities for women silenced by power. Adam provided the funding, but Clara made the rules. She was no longer cleaning floors or living under suspicion. She was directing meetings, hiring staff, and planning campaigns. For Emily, watching Clara grow into this role was proof that justice wasn't only about courtrooms. It was about giving people back their voices. The foundation became a living example that the truth could survive, even against wealth and influence, and Clara's name now carried respect, not shame. Ethan adjusted to the changes better than anyone expected. He still spent time with his father, visiting the Hamilton estate when necessary, but he preferred being with Clara. He told her once, in his innocent way, that she was his real mom in the heart. Clara smiled and told him he would always be part of her life. Adam supported their bond, understanding that Ethan's happiness depended on feeling safe and loved. He no longer tried to erase Clara's presence from their lives. Instead, he encouraged it. For Ethan, the two worlds finally made sense, the luxury of his father's side and the warmth of Clara's care. He knew exactly where love and truth lived. Whenever he looked at Clara, he remembered the courage it took for her to stand strong when everyone turned against her. Ethan's laughter returned, his nightmares faded, and he once again felt like a child, free to dream. As the months passed, Clara learned to breathe again. The fear that once followed her disappeared. She walked through the city without shame, no longer hiding from people's eyes. She worked hard at the foundation, but also allowed herself moments of rest, surrounded by Ethan's joy and Emily's friendship. One evening, after a long day, Clara stepped outside and watched the sunset. The colors in the sky reminded her of everything she had survived. She thought of the courtroom, the lies, the humiliation, and the pain. But now she was free, and she didn't need to shout or fight anymore. The truth had spoken for itself, and it had won. Clara closed her eyes, letting the peace sink in. For the first time in a long while, her heart was calm. The story that began with accusations ended with justice. The sun disappeared slowly, and Clara smiled, knowing she had found her place in the world again. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.